Hello, friends, and welcome back with us as we are doing our eighth podcast today, as we will be studying sections from Deuteronomy 17 and then finishing Deuteronomy and going into Joshua. So we get out of the law, so to speak, of the first five books of Moses in those, but you still see things as we continue on, and the importance of even carrying on Moses' word. And his words. And you see how Moses gave instruction in these times to Joshua, what he should do, what he should say. So much individual detail and the repetitiveness. I mean, you probably notice here in Deuteronomy a lot of repetitiveness between Exodus through Numbers. But we also have to remember in this time frame, this was how people learned. They didn't have things written down. They didn't have things. They tell things by word. And so a lot of them, whether as we get to see some things, it says they wrote stuff on stones, but what they wrote down, they were supposed to share with people, with their children, with others, so that there was a continual learning process so that people could remember what was important here in this aspect. And so as we're starting this beginning part of Deuteronomy in 17, some of the things that stick out here, especially in this message, you'll see lots of rules, lots of regulations, lots of do this, don't do that. One of the things that sticks out, which a lot of people have referred to even in things of today, was about how God gave them permission that they could have a king over them if they wanted. I mean, he said that, once you have entered the land of the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled down in it, you might say, let's appoint a king over us as all our neighboring nations have done. You can indeed appoint over you a king that the Lord your God selects. You can appoint over you a king who is one of your fellow Israelites, but you are not allowed to appoint over you a foreigner who is not one of your fellow Israelites. So there were stipulations in all of that. And the king wasn't supposed to be someone in this sense mighty. I mean, here it clearly says they shouldn't have a lot of horses. They shouldn't do certain things. So there was certain rules and stuff that I have, but that inkling, that interest, so to speak, of having a king rule over them was even prevalent in this point of time, even before it came to light later on.
And as we get into the story of the kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel, we see that there's an ongoing ambivalence in Scripture around this idea of a king. And as you say, I think it continues today. There are times when I'm very thankful that we have a government, and there are other times where I think, oh, dang it, let's just get rid of it all. And there is that back and forth through all history of whether or not we need that focused leadership in a king. We don't name our government as a king, but that's just a technicality in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even going through these rules, like even with sense, you see as we go through, you even see the reminder of how we're supposed. The care is supposed to be for women and children and orphans and widows, all different kind of things. You see a repetitiveness in this, as we talked about even previously, of the importance of caring for these individuals. And so this was part of a normal routine for them in such aspect, but these are still things that is a reminder to them that they're supposed to be continuing to doing, especially it's like when it tells them about in their fields and in their properties and things like, not to clear everything, but to leave some things so that others can come and have a share of what they're doing. And so just reminding of these and the importance of caring for those who are vulnerable in a way. And in that same instance, how that goes even with our lives today, caring for those, the least of these, if we like to say, who are not able to do for themselves, but the reminder of this is not something new that we just made up today. This is something that's been going on for years of caring for those and helping those who are just not always able to help themselves.
I just heard very recently the phrasing, live simply so that others may simply live. And it's I think it's a good standard for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and as we move on and go through, as we get to into chapter 23, there's rules of people who can enter the Lord's assembly, so to speak. And what's interesting in all this is how it says in verse 2 and 3, no one born of an illegitimate marriage can belong to the Lord's assembly. Not even the 10th generation of such children can belong to the Lord's assembly. Ammonites and Moabites can't belong to the Lord's assembly. Not even the 10th generation of such people can belong to them, because they didn't help you with food or water on your journey out of Egypt. Yet, when we think about later on of what's to come, David's ancestors, grandparents, are Moabites. And if we remember the story of Ruth, Moabite is mentioned in this. Of course, this is the relative of David. And so at some point of time, something was changed where Moabites were accepted and things in these situations. So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, first drawing us back to this question of a king and the continual refrain in Scripture that seems to say every time the people of faith draw a line and say, oh, absolutely not, eventually God turns the story around to include them. Every time we cast out, God draws in.
Yeah.
No Moabites, well, except maybe Ruth, because, and then you get David, and ultimately, though more than 10 generations later, that means that Jesus's ancestor was a Moabite.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and that's the thing to remember, just how things changed over time, how things went, because it's in the lineage, where that was there. It's the grace that we talk about. How is it extended to people sometimes that we don't realize where grace is extended to. And even talking about what we did just a little bit ago in parts of 24, there's a section in mine, starting at verse 14. It says, don't take advantage of poor or needy workers, whether they are fellow Israelites or immigrants who live in your land, but pay them what they earn. In other words, pay the salary the same day before the sun sets, because they are poor and their very life depends on that pay. So they don't cry out against you to the Lord. And so it was didn't matter where they were in life. It was a matter of treating everybody the same. Whether if they worked the time, they earned those wages, they should be paid those wages. And not treated differently because of who they were, whether they were poor, whether they were immigrant and stuff. And today you see a lot of difference in that. You see a lot of not always equality amongst people. And so,
well, I think that the key thing for me is that how you and I treat each other is meant to be equal.
right.
God seems to have a preference for the weak, the oppressed, the needy.
Yes.
That we should be equal. God is not.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. That's lots of truth there. But he reminds us of who are we supposed to care for and what we're supposed to do. Some of the things another thing that stuck out to me as we move on is Moses is giving them instructions on what they're supposed to do as they get ready to enter into the promised land. And he tells them, he's not able to, he's not going to be able to be there, but Joshua's going to leave him in there. And he gives them a specific called, in my book, it says stones of instruction, or it was the instruction of what to do. It starts in chapter 27. And he says to keep all of the commandments that he's done, and that the same day that they cross into the Jordan, that the land of the Lord is giving them, that they're supposed to set up stones, and then to write on the stones what he is about to share with them. And I love this because as I think of stones, and I think of the stones, it's like a remembrance, so that when they go back and they can see that they're going to remember. This is what Moses' important thing. They're supposed to remember what God had done for them in this time frame, and what was important to them, and what they were supposed to follow. And I think of stones in our own situations, and and think of, sometimes we, in the church, as you can see, well, these were the pillars, or these were the stones of the church, and who those people were that was important. And I think of our own, like, what are the stones in our lives that we can go back and look at and remember, and say, you know what, God was part of that. That was part of these things, and seeing where God is in our own things. But
I think, we, although not in this part, more in 2 Samuel, when we get there, that notion of a stone of memory. The word for a stone of memory in Hebrew is Ebenezer. And I'm trying to remember which hymn it is. Come thou fount of hither I raise mine Ebenezer.
Yep.
That we are to have these stones of memory that we lift up, that we mark, which can draw us. I don't know whether there's more you want to point to in Deuteronomy, but that certainly draws me to the entrance into the land in Joshua, when they cross over in chapter 4 of Joshua.
Right.
As they cross the Jordan, they are commanded to take stones from the middle of the river and carry them to their first encampment.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, Joshua then sets up a marker in the river. That, nobody gets to see that one because the water came over top of it again, but it's there as well, that stone of memory. That allows us, there is this refrain of, when your children see these stones and ask, what do these stones mean? Then you get to tell the story again.
That was a great leeway, because that's what, Moses has given them these stones of instructions, and basically curses and blessings. If they do this, they do that, what they'll receive, all these things. And it's mostly like just obeying the Lord. If they obey the Lord and what they do, what happens in the forward is going to be a beautiful. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, like, of how the abundance just shares of the obedience of what they're doing. But yes, as you go and you get into this part of Joshua, of course, we now know, Moses has died. He gets up there. He gets to see the land, doesn't get to go through. And then Joshua's commissioned to do it. And immediately, Joshua's, what his command is to get the people ready, because you're about to cross over. I mean, it's not like he has much question or much time to debate. I mean, it's like God, he gives Moses, or the Lord gives Joshua the orders, and he tells the people to get ready and get everything ready to go, because we're about to cross over. And he sends the spies over, just like normal. They go into this whole thing and to see everything, and boom, this is where it all starts.
Before we get into that, there is this beautiful, intimate portrait at the very end of Deuteronomy that is easy to pass over. In chapter 34, verses 5 and 6, it says, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the command of the Lord. He buried him in the valley of the land of Moab near Beth Peor, and no one knows his burial place to this day." This notion that the Almighty came down and buried Moses. What a beautiful, intimate portrait of the relationship between Moses and the Lord, that to have been buried by the Almighty.
Yeah. And even said, like, he was this 120 years old, and it said, he could have still went on. It even says here, like,
his eyes weren't impaired.
They're still there. his vigor hadn't diminished a bit. He was still able to continue life, but it was this time. And at that time, like you said, just to see, I had it started in my Bible as well, of how just to think about that, of God literally bearing Moses. And to this day, no one even knows where that is. As it says, no prophet like Moses has ever emerged in Israel again. I mean, it just to think about that, of he was one who, and it says he was one who knew God face to face. And to think about what he did for his people of all that time, for someone who said he was not able to do it, his life of leading those people all those years to continue, for the most part, staying faithful, except for his mishap of the rock. He was one who was just one of those people that you could just look at and say, wow, Moses was one of those who was really a follower of God, obedient to God, and just
a stone of memory in his own life.
Way. Yes, exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so as we transition into this time into Joshua, and I said we talk about this as he gets these orders, like this is the thing. He goes into it, and Rahab is a big piece. Rahab is also in the lineage. This, it's hard to believe. Like what? But if you look at the lineage, Rahab is, and even though they were supposed to not save anybody, they gave the promise to Rahab that her and her family would not be destroyed when all this came. And yet later on we see, Rahab, who was known as the prostitute at the time, was literally one who saved the people from the spies, because she said she knew that God had sent them and they were about to take over. And so it's a neat situation here where you see someone would least expect to be in this lineage, in this thing, and what she did and how she saved these things. I mean, and even her, it's almost like she was setting the terms for what was supposed to happen. And so like she's giving them a chance to stay, and then she goes, well, I'll do this if you make sure like that we're safe, and basically we're safe and we're not destroyed. And
she had already done her part.
Yeah.
When she asked for those terms.
Just right.
She had already hidden them.
Yep.
She had already protected them. She had already told the soldiers, they went out the gate. If you hurry, you can still catch them. Which is one of my favorite lines in quick, go after them. You can overtake them. Yeah. I mean, she had already done her piece. Yep. I think that one of the other things that strikes me in that idea is how fragile a thing this will of God is. Mm. We talk about the will of God and the power of God. And there is, you all have already heard one of the more common phrases that I use to describe God is the Almighty. Mm. And I do believe that God is almighty. And at the same time, this story of faith is fundamentally fragile. Oh, yeah. Think how things would have been different had Rahab said to the soldiers, yes, they're up on the roof. Think how different things would be if Joshua had said, really, the other side of the river, this side's pretty good. How about we just hang out here? All of these fragile moments that come together to create the story of faith.
And even all this, like one of the lines, like she says in 12 is like, give me a sign of good faith. As you said, my version said, but spare the lives of my father, my mother, my brothers, and my sisters, along with everything they own. Rescue us from death. And they swore to her that their lives would be safe. And
provided they stay in the
Yes,
spot with
provided
the
they
red
were. Yes,
with the red
with the
thread.
red thread. Yes, yes, yes. And not to, and she's and she they could not reveal what was supposed to happen. He says, if you don't reveal our mission, we will deal loyally and faithful with you as the Lord gives us the land. And so she had to keep everything quiet, which basically, what would she do? I mean, she's already kept quiet. She's already done, like you said, what they did. And so the spies were able to get back. They were good to go, and they begin to cross over. And as we touched on, in the leeway in, once they got over, the Jordan is another, one of those reminder of the Red Sea fight situations. The Jordan, opens up for them to walk across, and they get back there. And difference is they don't have people chasing them this time. It's just getting over this Jordan River. But this is another situation where they get to experience this, the Almighty or God or whatever you say, at work of helping them get across the Jordan so that they can get into the land that was promised to them.
It's hard to read the story of Joshua and not see in it the parallels to Moses.
Yes.
Both hear from God, both are told to be strong, both cross over water, both send spies into the land, both, there are all these little parallels. And I do think that the scriptures want us to see those parallels, in part because I'm quite sure that once Moses died, the people looked around and said, well, now, wait a minute, who's going to lead us now? And sure, Joshua said, well, don't you remember Moses said I would? And still, I'm pretty sure there were a few folks that wanted to say, well, okay, but do you have a sign for us? Why should we trust you, dude?
Yeah. And it is, and and you see it. I mean, and it, you see the difference too in the Red Sea part. Moses took the staff here. In this instance, the people carrying the tent or the covenant,
the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, they were stood in the water until everybody cleared, and then once everybody got through, then they washed out, and as soon as they stepped on the land, it came back again. So a little bit differences, but very similar situations where, remembering they had to carry this Ark of the Covenant with them where they were everywhere they went. And so this was another opportunity of the presence of God being with them in all of this sense. And so we see they get across, and when they get there, then we highlight a little bit about these stones, the stones that they're talking about. And, and it says in the Sings, it says Joshua called. So this is chapter 4, verse 4. It said, Joshua called for the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one man per tribe. He said to them, cross over into the middle of the Jordan, up to the Lord your God's chest. Each of you lift up a stone on his shoulder to match the number of the tribes of the Israelites. This will be a symbol among you. In the future, your children may ask, what do these stones mean to you? And then you will be able to tell them that the water of the Jordan was cut off before the Lord's covenant chest. And it was a matter of those times, making these memories, so to speak. It was a matter of being able to share that this is something they would remember. And this was something they had to share, because there weren't ways, like we said, you didn't have the books and things for people to write stuff down. These were things that were told, so that when things got later on in life and people ask, what do these stones mean? It was a matter of being able to share what it was that God had done for them in this aspect. And it said Joshua set up the 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan where the feet of the priests had stood while carrying the covenant chest. They are still there today. So to think of that.
And I think it causes me to wonder, what are the things that our families put in place so that children say, why? I think of whether it is making sure that there is a worn Bible next to our chair, so that a child says, why is that book there? Why does it look so worn out? Or whether it is saying a prayer. My family still says the prayer that I learned as a child. I think my father learned it as a child. I honestly don't know where it came from. Mental note, ask your mother where that came from. But anyway, and now my grandchildren are learning it. I think that's important, that we have ways to be able to say to our children, this is who we are.
Yes. Yeah. In my Common English version, which is, it's a Wesley Study Bible, one of the things that it talks about is remembering who you are. And it says, in a pluralistic society that values tolerance above all virtues, it can be hard to remember that our allegiance is to God, whose ways are often contrary to those of our neighbors. The Israelites surged forward to settle the land across the Jordan on the basis of God's promise. As we actively remember God's grace in our lives, we summon the courage to step out in faith and take on tasks and challenges that may threaten our identity and our peace. Beyond tangible reminders, we ourselves are living stones whose builder and maker is the eternal God.
Good word.
And I thought, what a way to remember who we are as well. Remember whose we are. There's still stones in our lives. As they did this and they focused on this and set stones up, and for people to reminder, again, just like you said, having those times in our families and in our churches, in our times where we get to look back and we get to say, hey, what was the importance of that?
Peter, the Apostle Peter, in one of the letters of Peter, speaks of the people of faith as a peculiar people. We don't like the idea of being peculiar. We want to be ordinary. We want to be part of the crowd.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, I do think that the people of faith are called to be a little bit odd.
Yeah.
And odd enough that somebody asks, why? Why are you going to the soup kitchen on a Sunday morning at 5:30? Why do you help those refugee families? Why do you come on a Saturday to referee upward basketball games? Why are you doing these things?
It's good words, it's stones, so to speak, in our lives that we can say this is why and what those mean. And yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Reminder too of, who is our stone, who is our cornerstone, who is our one that helps us here and gets us through these, and being able to share that in this aspect. Well, the next big story we have, and probably many of you are familiar with, is the Battle of Jericho. So once they...
Time to fit?
Yes, yes. It's like part of me is like, just wants to sing the song. Because that's what we learned as a child, the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. but it was just one of these, situations. Like once they get across there, and this was one of the first places that they had to get into, and what they had to do, and it seems kind of silly, like 6 days to march around the city one time, but on the seventh day you had to march around it 7 times, and then blow the trumpets, and everything went, there was so much more because, people left, other ones went through, and it was just that opportunity of them to begin to take their place in this promised land. It's a story. It's one of the ones as you take. It's not only here in Jericho, but as you see, if you go out these next couple of chapters, there is that sign of the Israelites continuing to defeat, and how even kings in the south and in the north tried to team up and thought, for sure, if we teamed up together, we'll be able to beat the Israelites. But even the teaming up didn't help. But it's the seeing where God continues to be present with them, even in the midst of all of these situations. There's a lot there. I mean, there's a lot in this sense. In Jericho, when you see what they had to do, when they got through, it doesn't seem like a lot, but for them there was a lot in that instance. But even in a sense of once they did, it says they wiped out everything in the city as something reserved for God, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. And then it said, after they went through and got everything out, they went back, let Rahab and her family go, and then, but there was at the time it said Joshua made a decree, and it said that if anyone started to rebuild the city, that they'd be cursed. But yet each time at the end of chapter 6, it says the Lord was with Joshua, and news about him spread throughout the land.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place for us to end this week. We end our reading again with that same kind of declaration. Joshua conquered the whole country just as the Lord had promised Moses, and assigning the various lands to all of the tribes. We look forward next week to continuing this story as the people continue to live into this promised land. To take possession of it is the phrase that my scriptures use, and begin to experience life in the promised land. So we look forward to talking with you next week, and hope that you can come to join us in worship, and possibly come be a part of the TGIW class that Pastor Dan is leading.
Yes. Have a great week, friends.
Thank you.